Welcome back to the Assertive Podcast. I'm Erica.
I'm Jess.
And we are licensed professional counselors in Texas, reviewing Am I the Asshole Reddit threads to help you learn skills for communication, healthy boundary setting, and assertive interpersonal functioning. Today, we're going to be exploring emotional boundaries and how to kind of protect your emotional energy. We are going to be doing that with a post titled, Am I the Asshole for Kicking My Friend Out because she emotionally exhausts me?
My friend, let's call her Sarah. Sarah's 22. We went to high school together, but we only started hanging out when we went to uni. She had a long-distance boyfriend who she was dating for about 2 years before they mutually broke up in 2021. She was really depressed after the breakup, and I tried my best to support her during that time, even though I didn't understand why she was so dramatic about it since I'm asexual and they weren't serious for a long time. I realized after a while that Sarah would do anything to bring up her breakup. She would randomly on days start crying or getting depressed about the breakup if we were talking about my anxieties I had. I realized I couldn't even get a word in. And her affections and feelings towards her ex-boyfriend got more and more dramatic each iteration. She would sometimes complain and curse his new girlfriend, even though that she's hooking up with a mutual friend of ours. And I told her I didn't appreciate that because neither she nor I knew his girlfriend. I started wanting to hang out less and less with her because she would talk about him, and I would just sit there feeling drained after she left. Last week, Sarah came over for a visit unexpectedly and stayed for several hours. It was after 11 p.m., even though I told her I needed to call my parents to discuss something emotional and serious. But she took it as an opportunity to talk about her ex again while I listened silently. After that, she even called her friend and spoke to them for 40 minutes, which I found incredibly rude. I left the room and called my parents, after which I was emotional and even cried a little. When I returned to my room, Sarah was off the phone, so I asked her when she would be leaving because I felt tired. She said soon and continued to try to stay and talk about her ex. I was not in the mood for it, so I told her that she needed to let it go because it's been close to 3 years and she's emotionally exhausting me. I told her she needed to leave. I feel bad for saying that and kicking her out, and Sarah texted me saying that I should feel bad since her ex is still a sore subject for her. My other friends say I was in the wrong and I should apologize, but I don't think I should be the only one apologizing. Am I the asshole?
Interesting. Let's start here. How do you talk to your clients about emotional energy?
Yeah, I think sometimes kind of confusing and difficult a little bit. I usually start by having clients tune in to like, how did you feel after that interaction? Especially, when like dating and meeting new people, you want to have people in your life who energize you. So really kind of doing a little autopsy after an interaction to figure out if you're totally zapped or if it energized you. And sometimes emotional boundaries are also just taking on other people's emotions. It sounds like maybe, I don't know that this OP had that issue. They seem to be kind of non-emotional. But sometimes if you find that you're in one kind of emotional state and then you engage with somebody and you feel in a totally different emotional state after that, that can sometimes indicate some loose emotional boundaries there. What about you? What do you say about it?
I help them identify their emotional energy very similar to how you do as far as tuning into body cues and emotion cues. I think I also let them know the importance, and I think I get maybe more resistance from my population because I do work with a lot of like people pleasers, or what I like to refer to as emotion managers, where they tend to manage the emotions of everybody around them and kind of the emotions of their interactions.
Yeah.
And so that particular personality trait tends to have loose emotional boundaries because they need to manage it because it feels so uncomfortable for them when other people are feeling distressed.
So they'll say, I need you to feel better because your emotions are bothering me. Yeah. I think sometimes, there's even certain characteristics. Some people tend to use the word like, emotional vampires, where they just zap the energy out of the room. She references that later. And I think sometimes those characteristics can look similar. I call it being like a conversation hostage.
Yeah.
Where it's like, do you really need me here for this? Because like, this is not a dialogue. Like you're talking at me. I think that is a sign that somebody tends to take up a lot more space in the relationship. And I also say every time you talk, if it reminds them of themselves, you're probably interacting with a pretty selfish person. So, it's every time that you would need to have a space to talk about your own things, they're bringing up their own shit. I think you're probably interacting with somebody who's kind of an emotional vampire like that,
Yeah, absolutely.
Hmm.
What would you say are maybe some of OP's cues that she's getting emotionally drained? Did you pick up on any in her post?
Yeah, I think she did pick up anytime I talk about my anxieties, she switches it to focus on her. I think she's starting to get kind of resentful, which is a sign. And I think she's starting to kind of wanting to distance. She says, I started wanting to hang out less and less with her. And then she noticed afterwards she would feel totally drained. So it seems like instead of maybe being a little direct about finding this draining, she's kind of just slowly tried to like distance herself a little bit over time too.
With the distancing, there's also when they do spend time together, I noticed she would disengage from the conversation. So she said, I just listen silently.
Yeah.
And so you attempt to avoid interacting with them. When you do interact with them, there's still some avoidance going on, and you're still kind of taking a step back and not actively engaging with this person.
And kind of like learned helplessness of like, well, I can't get a word in, so I'm just going to give up and just be talked at for several hours.
Yeah.
Sarah needs some therapy. Sarah's got some little borderline-y stuff going on here, I think.
Yeah. And it's interesting that the OP wrote in here kind of some of her frustration is when the breakup's been done and over with for several years.
Yeah.
And both of them have more or less moved on. It sounds like the ex is in an official relationship. They refer to her as girlfriend, whereas Sarah's hooking up, so maybe less official, maybe like friends with benefit type of situation with another mutual friend that they share.
Yeah.
And so I think part of that dysfunction is like you both are moving on. Neither one of you are actively engaging in the relationship or reconciliation measures or keeping tabs on each other, apart from maybe stalking on Instagram or other social media.
Yeah.
And yet it's the only topic of conversation. There's an incongruence there in behavior and conversation.
Yeah, because like I'm sure she's not talking about new things. They haven't been interacting. So she's probably just rehashing the same shit, and really trying to loop the author into kind of commiserating with her of like, God, that new girl, what a bitch, or whatever, and it's making the author uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Like, dude,
I will say the author did a good job of setting a boundary there and telling her, I don't appreciate that because we don't know this new girlfriend and we really shouldn't be commenting on her. So I think for maybe not doing a good job with her emotional boundaries, she at least did a good job there.
I agree.
That particular topic of conversation.
It's something like that got outside the OP's kind of integrity of like, I'm not somebody who talks about people I don't know, and this feels kind of icky, like, bitchy girl kind of stuff to do. Yeah. I talk about the concept of like venting versus processing also. And so there's a time and place for both of them. I think venting is often with anger, where you're just kind of needing a spot just to get that thought process out. And I say processing is where you end up in a different place than when you started. And I think that Sarah is stuck in like this venting for years, like, as a friend sometimes, right? Or just in any relationship, sometimes there might be more of kind of a load where that person does need more space for a bit. And they might be in a venting spot for a while, especially if there's anger and they're kind of sort through those emotions. But for somebody to not be moving towards processing after any of these conversations, and I think continuing to kind of sign up to be the just kind of sounding board for that, I think that's when it can start to feel really draining too, of like, there's no mental shift in how we're thinking about this. If you're finding yourself in an emotional hostage conversation that's being revisited and they keep ending on the same place when they started, that's when sometimes we can tell of like, okay, this is not productive anymore.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I like what you said about the balance of relationships, and sometimes it is unbalanced. Sometimes you are giving more than you're receiving, and sometimes you're receiving more than you're giving.
Yeah.
But I also think that's more of the exception versus the rule. Like people are going to go through seasons in their lives. And so, as part of their support network, sometimes you are having to support them. And maybe that's why you have that deeper bench.
Yeah. And Sarah's doing this real time where she's like, okay, the author has other things to do, but I'm going to sit here in her apartment and call my other friend for 40 minutes. But she's asking like the same thing from all these people. I hear it the most when clients have had a death, and grief can take a long time to work through. And I find it happens a lot where clients are like, gosh, people give me a couple weeks and then the world kind of moves on as it should. But I think it can feel really lonely if somebody's having this major loss, because people do get tired of hearing about it, but we say, it takes about a year to kind of go through the full season of that. If you had a client who maybe said, hey, I have this person in my life, they're going through serious stuff, but they're just overloading me with talking about this, do you kind of have loose directives of how to know when they need to almost outsource or deepen the bench? Like, what is too much in terms of, our loved ones having a season of life, which is hard?
I think it's appropriate to outsource if you are feeling your emotional energy drained from those conversations, or you just have your own stuff going on. That's maybe consuming more of your energy, and so you have less to give. We have to divvy that up between dealing with our own things in our life and also supporting those we care about and that we want to be a support for. And so noticing your cues and noticing where you're at that particular day is going to be important for knowing, can I actually sit here and listen to this? Can I support them today?
So you would say this energy bucket, I have to apply this for all different tasks. So it's like, oh, well, I find after I hang out with this person, I don't want to go do my self-care thing because I'm too worn out, or even it's taking away from some of your needs being met. And that's when you would say, this has gone on. This is too much. I'm overextending myself.
Now we're outsourcing. Now we're outsourcing. And I think outsourcing, people may feel bad or they get that inappropriate guilt where it makes them a good friend. But I actually think it makes you a better friend because you're sitting here silently listening to her vent about the same thing she's been venting about for the past few years. Whereas outsourcing it, maybe somebody's going to give her a different perspective or at least engage in that conversation with her.
Yeah. She might need a fresh set of ears or something. Like she's obviously, something is not working here in her willingness to process through this.
So I think outsourcing is a kindness, and you're simply saying, I understand the amount of energy you need from me and I can't get it. So rather than you being frustrated by you telling me all of this and you're getting nothing from me, your time and energy is probably going to be better spent telling somebody else who does have the energy for it.
Yeah. And I think boundaries are not like a last resort. I don't mean that, but I think, there could have been conversations here talking about the level of draining that's happening before we're like kicking somebody out of the house, even as a friend, to say, hey, I've noticed that we've been talking about this a lot and you seem to not have any new thoughts about this or changes of emotion. And this doesn't really seem productive. I don't know what your hang up is here, but are you recognizing that in yourself kind of thing? Or just like sharing, like reflecting, because sometimes people don't notice, sometimes if you tell them like, dude, you are stuck and you've been acting crazy for 3 years. Sometimes, using that, like, hey, my experience of you is this, that can be a good learning tool.
Yeah.
And I think like giving that person the opportunity to respond to that first before we have the thing of we're ending this relationship or whatever, I think that there needs to be a little bit more discussion about that too, for that the OP to be a little bit more direct.
Yeah. This happens a lot with passive communicators. And I imagine, I don't want to stereotype, but I imagine we get more passive folks on Reddit, or at least the post-war polling, than maybe aggressive. So maybe a combo of passive and passive aggressive, where they're really waiting until they hit like this last straw. And I call it a breaking point. Like you didn't set a boundary till you hit your breaking point, which means you're typically emotionally flooded at this point. You're not doing it in a kind way. You're just kind of throwing everything at them and then expecting them to respond appropriately.
So she's in that pattern too, that kind of exploding doormat we referenced early on, where she's been stuffing and then it got too big there at the end.
Yeah. And I will give her a little bit of credit. I mean, God, whatever bag she is stuffing that shit into is huge if you've been doing this for close to 3 years.
I feel like some kind of
that is
Santa
a long,
Claus. That is a
long
lot.
ass time to hold all
Yeah.
of this in before you eventually just said, like, get the fuck out. You are emotionally exhausting me.
That's a long 3 years, especially for somebody that she's not even really understanding it, because she's like, this isn't a deregulation
in my
I've
lane,
ever
yeah.
experienced, you know, or like an issue that I have. But she gave her a lot of space
Yeah,
to do that, you know.
absolutely.
I think it comes up. We had another therapist I know talk about this, that, you know, especially I think mostly with like married couples or romantically, one of the burdens of it is that you have to listen to your spouse talk about things that maybe you're not really interested in. Maybe you don't want to hear what they ate for breakfast or whatever went on, you know. And so it's not that we need to be constantly having these like engaging conversations. Like there's going to be times in relationships, right, where we're just like, oh God, they just need to talk about this, and you might feel drained, but that is sometimes part of partnership as well, you know. And I think to say, hey, I don't want you to talk to me about your day, that's not okay either. We have to have some kind of tolerance for a little bit of conversational kind of duty sometimes, I think. But
Yeah.
And too, I mean, I would be afraid to set a boundary because this girl can obviously hold a grudge. Like she's gonna stab me in my sleep or something. She's obsessive about relationships.
Mm-hmm.
That's a lot. And they obviously did not mutually break up in 2021. Homegirl's mad about it like 3 years later. Oh.
You know, we don't always go through and read the comments, but I was curious the other day, and I went through and I read some of the comments. And so OP was actually saying that because it was a long distance relationship, probably for the last year before they broke up, she was saying how tired she was of this. It's not really meeting her needs. She's ready to break up. So she was ready to break up. And like, that's what she was talking about all the time, was just how unavailable her partner was, how it's not meeting her needs. And then they finally broke up.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious if maybe to OP it seemed mutual because of these past conversations. That maybe he broke up with her. And that
salty.
So yeah, she wanted to be the breakup-er instead of the breakup-y. She ended up being the breakup-y. So now she's going to bitch and moan about it for the next 5 to 10 years, however long.
Yeah.
She decides to go on with this.
I don't know. This is probably not the best. I don't know where I heard this, where they say generally the grieving time, however long you're in the relationship, half of that time is what you need to kind of recover.
I've heard that too. Yes.
I don't know. So if they're in a relationship, this is for 2 years. The last year she was kind of foot out the door. I'd say 6 months or a year at the most. So for her to be 3 years in, that is absolutely like not appropriate responses to that.
Mm-hmm.
Oh man.
And that would definitely be a flag that you need to go do something with that.
Yeah. And I was telling you when we were prepping, I've had something not this extreme, but I met a friend in college. Everything was going smoothly. Then I started figuring out like, oh, she's got some crazy tendencies where she would bring up this, just obsessive about this boy, right? And like this relationship, and just so insecure, was constantly seeking my validation. And I got to this point, you know, I went over and I basically broke up with her. I said, hey, you are really obsessed about this. You seem quite deregulated. This is draining me. You know, you got some things to figure out, and like I need some space from this friendship. And like we haven't spoken since then, but I just it felt this very immature to me, and I just wasn't interested in that at that time. But that gets old, and that didn't go on. That was maybe only, you know, a month or two. It wasn't a long time, but that came up pretty quick where I'm like, this is not a person I want to continue investing in. You know, they just dominate relationships and dominate discussions and talk about themselves all the time. Like we're like in our 20s, like you still boy crazy, like grow the fuck up. That's how I felt. She was older than me too. She might have been getting to 30 at that point. I was probably early 20s, but I'm like, girl, like, you know?
Yeah. Good point. Yeah. Some friendships are not meant to be lifelong friendships. And I don't know if she said it in the post or if I read it in some of the comments. They had known each other since elementary school.
Okay, so
I think they just didn't become, they just weren't close until they ended up at university together. So they had known each other for a really long time. So I'm curious if there was maybe some expectations or obligation, I think is the word I want. There was an obligation that the friendship remain, or that she stay part of her support of Sarah's support system.
Yeah. So maybe almost feeling kind of entitled to the listening ear even too, of like, I can dump, and I can just dump and dump and dump, and I expect you to stick around. And then that person had a limit, and it's like, we're not allowed to have limits. We've known each other our whole life. Things like that too can happen.
Yeah. And I think that can be hard if you've had somebody in your life for that long, and now all of a sudden you're changing the way you interact with them. I think sometimes people will accuse you of, you know, changing, of being two-faced, of you know, all these other things. Acting brand new is maybe, I don't know if they still use that lingo.
Oh, they use that.
That was the lingo I grew up with. You were like, oh, you're acting brand new. And so, like, yes, I am acting brand new, because I've learned this is not the way healthy friendships work. So either like get on board or jump ship.
And people who care about each other in relationships, nobody wants to think that they're just draining that person, right? Like they, you know, and so think if somebody's telling you something like that and you're like, well, how dare you? I think, you know, having like an emotional hostage, I think that just shows like selfishness, you know, and I think it's okay to say, this isn't somebody I want to have a relationship with. And we're lucky with friends, we get to choose those relationships. Like family, we don't get to choose that, you know, but friends, we do get to choose that. And if you're in this relationship with people who are just taking and taking and taking, you're allowed to say that that's not working for you, and you don't want to continue to invest in that friendship.
Yeah. You know? And that doesn't make you a bad friend or a bad person or an asshole.
Right.
So
you don't have to like everybody, right?
Correct.
Yeah. So what are some some like practical things that the OP could have done to maybe set boundaries before we hit this kind of breaking point?
Yeah. So there are a few things I know I personally have in place. Biggest one is I don't accept uninvited visitors. Yeah. I could be sitting right next to my door and somebody's knocking on my door. I'm not going to get up and even see who it is. Everybody in my circle knows you don't just pop up unannounced.
I do like contactless delivery on like DoorDash even for no reason. I'm like, I'm not answering the door for anybody, even if I invite you over.
Yes. So
not welcomed.
There's that. So I'll have friends who are like, oh, I'm 5 minutes away. Something came up and I want to come over. Usually only like my inner circle would have done that. And typically I'd be like, okay, this is obviously an emergency, because they know I don't like this shit. And so they are typically respectful of the boundary. So I would know, okay, this is an anomaly. This isn't the norm. Okay. So that's one of the first things I do. Probably the thing that I use the most is I set time expectations at the beginning of conversations. And I probably do this the most with my mom. She likes to just kind of talk on and on. So I'll pick up the phone and I'll say, hey, I have 15 minutes. What do you need? Or what's going on? Then helpful. 15 minutes rolls around and I'll be like, okay, well, you know, it's been 15 minutes. I have to go, but we can like continue this later. And I'm not lying. Maybe I'm not going to do anything in 15 minutes when the conversation is up. But what I'm essentially communicating is I only have 15 minutes of emotional energy.
Yeah, we talk about boundaries are helpful because if you front load the expectation, then you don't really have to lift any heavier. So then when 15 minutes is up, she's not suddenly like, what? She kind of already knew that you might be interrupting it. And yeah, I kind of like that too, just as like like I wouldn't be like, oh, this is somebody setting a boundary with me, but I'm like, oh, this is helpful. That gives me some kind of context for like how open I want to be or what I maybe want to talk about.
How deep we get into things.
Yeah, that's helpful. So then at 15 minutes, you just interrupt like, hey, I got to go. Is that what you would do?
Yeah. I mean, I'm not extremely firm with that to where like the second turns to 15 minutes and I like stop them. I'll let them kind of finish that thought. I'll maybe give a little feedback. And then I say, but it's been 15 minutes. I actually have to go, but we can continue this.
I love that.
Yeah. So for this post, I think doing that with visits, like if she showed up unannounced, like one, I would have been setting a boundary way before this particular day and saying like, hey, I know you came over unannounced and I just really don't like that. I like to be prepared to have people in my house and I like to divvy up my energy. Introverts especially like to be able to know this.
Yeah.
And so in the future, I prefer if you didn't do it and I'm not going to answer the door or I won't let you in.
Okay.
This particular day, if she came over and I did want to let her in, she knew she had a phone call with her parents about something big and emotional. And so one, she should have just said, I really don't have the time. Or two, she should have set a time expectation on that. Like, hey, I have to have this conversation with my parents. And so you can only stay till 2:00. And then at 2:00, I would have been getting up and being like, okay, well, we can finish this another time, but I need to talk to my parents. And that's probably going to take the rest of the evening.
Yeah. So this OP has been kind of doormatting herself for way too long. Just
in like every arena.
Every arena, I'm like, hey, I got this thing. But then also that thing comes up and she's like, oh, well, I'll just call my parents later. It's like she's letting her kind of steamroll her too.
Well, she didn't ask her to leave. Her friend was busy. So she's like, all right, I guess I'll take this opportunity to go talk to my parents. She's on the phone with somebody else.
Oh, Sarah. Sarah is a hot mess.
Yeah. Sarah's missing some social cues here.
Yeah. Sarah is very socially selfish, I think.
I think the other thing I would have done as far as boundaries is when I got off the phone call with my parents, OP said, how much longer are you going to be staying or what time do you think you're going to leave? She relinquished control to Sarah. Bro, that's your house. You pay those bills or you're paying the tuition for that dorm. Why are you letting Sarah decide how long she stays?
Yeah.
That makes no sense. I would have been coming out and saying, hey, that conversation with my parents was really draining and I think it's best if you leave. I need to be alone.
Yeah, or even before, like, hey, I'm about to have a private conversation. I'm gonna need to talk to you later, ask you to go so I can have some privacy here. Yeah. And so she started off with being like, well, when are you gonna leave? And then she's like, well, I'm not. And then she's like, well, I'm feeling pretty tired. And then she still stayed. And then she's like, well, I'm not in the mood for it, but then she still stayed. And then it's like, it's been close to 3 years and you're crazy and you're exhausting me and you gotta go. It's like by her like being too soft, Sarah was not respecting that. So
yeah. I mean, she had at least 3, I would say, opportunities to kindly end this conversation before she hit her breaking point, and she didn't do any of them.
Yes. And we talk about, boundaries we teach people how to treat us. Like Sarah has been operating as Sarah has been operating for the last 3 years, and by not being, talk about being passive where, the author's saying, I need you to leave because I'm tired. She is probably tired, but she's still not really telling her what's really going on,
Yeah.
And so it's kind of throwing out things, trying to see if she's going to get the hint, and then she's having to escalate, but she's also let Sarah know that this is acceptable because this has gone on for 3 years like that.
She's kind of let Sarah be the dominant personality. Because even when she's saying I'm tired, she was saying, hey, when do you think you're leaving? Because I'm tired.
She said soon.
So she gave her some context clues, but she wasn't asking for her needs to be met or setting boundaries in that statement. She was still letting Sarah be in control.
Yeah. And I just wouldn't, the idea of having a friend that I just have to like tiptoe around or who doesn't respect when I'm tired, like that's not a relationship I'd want to have in my life, and she's really letting herself get treated like shit, I think, from a relationship that's really not giving much reciprocity in anything.
On the flip, as terrible of a conversationalist or friend that Sarah may be, Sarah's doing what works for her, and Sarah hasn't been told any different. Sarah hasn't been told she's emotionally draining.
Right.
Sarah hasn't been told it's inappropriate to stop by unannounced. Sarah wasn't told to leave. And so Sarah's really just doing what she's been doing for the past 2+ years. And of course, she's going to be taken off guard when you explode. So for the people on the other side of the exploding doormats, they often feel taken back because it just comes out of nowhere and they're like, should have told me I was exhausting you.
Yeah. And I can be inclined of being like, I shouldn't, but I think there's different levels of social and emotional intelligence.
Yes.
Sometimes I can find myself frustrated of like, I shouldn't have to tell you that being incredibly selfish is wrong. You should know that, and I'll get kind of like that too. And then that's on me for like, if I'm choosing to have people in my life who have maybe lower social intelligence, I might have to give more feedback or more reflections, if somebody's maybe a little bit more selfish or something like that. But yeah, I think the author was really hoping that she'd just move on. She was trying to buy the time, hoping to not have this difficult conversation with her, and that just did not happen. She sounds super intense.
You mentioned Sarah needs some therapy, and I think this is maybe a good topic. How do you suggest to people, without offending them, that they need some therapy?
Yeah, that's a good one. People have different kind of beliefs and stigmatizations about therapy. So I think the first kind of pulse check I would do is, what do I think this person thinks about therapy already? I mean, I'm also a therapist, so I have no problem being like, I think you should go to therapy. But realistically, if it was delicate, I'd probably say something like, hey, we've been revisiting this conversation really often for 3 years. It seems like there hasn't been a whole lot of like emotional movement on your end, and I can tell that this is bothering you. And I think we're kind of caught in some like loops on this. And I think it might be beneficial to talk to a therapist to get some kind of third party outside perspective to see if we can move the needle, because I think you're kind of stuck on this.
I think that's a sensitive way to say it.
Bet you, Craig, go pay somebody to fix you.
I mean, as a therapist, I think it's maybe easier for us to recommend it, and it maybe has some added weight. Right, where we say, this is a bit dysfunctional, and if you were my client, like, we have a lot of work to be doing, so you should maybe talk to a therapist about that.
Yeah.
You need some recommendations. So I think for us, it is maybe easier than the general population.
Yeah.
To be able to say.
It's almost like a doctor being like, you need to get that checked out. Like, yes. My brother's a doctor, right? To feel like, do that thing on that mole's looking, go get that checked out. I'd be like, oh shit, that's like professional advice, so that would hit differently there. I think attraction versus promotion can be helpful. And I think a lot of my clients, after they get to therapy, they notice it's beneficial, almost like an evangelist for therapy. If like, I want everybody in my life to do therapy, and I tell all of my friends about how great it is. And so I think even if somebody's already in therapy, by even just saying like, hey, I found this to be really helpful, or like, I got into therapy, and almost just kind of sharing your own experience, I think, can sometimes make it less personal.
Yes.
But for a non-therapist person, I think if you just kind of highlight, hey, I've noticed that you bring this up a lot. If you're just sharing kind of reflecting things, I can tell this is bothering you, and I know that you don't want to keep feeling this way. I'm not really sure what else you're needing from me in this, but I think this could be helpful in just kind of reflecting and not getting too personal or attacking. That would be good.
I think when I share recommendations, I do it from like a limitations perspective of, I think I've reached my limitation of being able to support you because nothing's changing. And having these conversations, I feel very helpless.
Ooh, I like that. It's like your own personal limitations as opposed to the other person's limitations.
Yes. Yeah. And it's very similar with I statements. It helps kind of keep their defenses down. Sometimes just direct feedback can be taken as an attack. And so keeping it really focused on you and your experience of, I feel kind of helpless and drained after these conversations because nothing's changing. And I know I'm not helping you because nothing's changing.
Yeah. So what would you do if maybe you had kind of referred somebody for therapy in like your personal life, and then they chose not to follow through with therapy, but then continued to talk to you about that in that way?
I would say, I've spoken with you about this before and my limitations. And I don't know if you've decided to go to therapy or you've not decided. That's between you and whoever. But I do need to stop having these conversations with you. I just put my foot down.
Okay. So that'd be a conversational boundary. So maybe even it's kind of like a suggestion. It's really also saying like, you and I are done talking about this at the same time.
Whether you go to a different friend, whether you go to a therapist. I mean, they're at university. Most colleges will give you at least 10 to 12 free sessions.
Yeah.
So I imagine she has resources available. But yes, I would do a conversational boundary of, I've made other suggestions, and that was me politely saying, I can't have this conversation with you.
Mm-hmm.
And so now I'm just going to say it directly. I can't have this conversation with you anymore.
So help me God. I think, even sometimes, if you're really kind of gentle in how you recommend a loved one explore counseling, sometimes they'll talk to you about what their reservations are, and so even kind of being really gentle and giving them a space of like, I can understand why that's intimidating. I don't think it hurts to try. Maybe just give it 4 sessions and see what it's like, and being really gentle, giving them space to maybe talk about why they haven't explored that before. It can be
Absolutely
helpful too, So if the OP decided that she did want to maintain the relationship with Sarah and there needed to be some repair there, what do you think that would look like to reconcile, perhaps?
I think communicating an apology for the delivery and maybe context of the message.
Okay.
I think there did need to be a boundary set. But I think doing it once we hit our breaking point and we're using a very aggressive communication style was not the correct way to do that. And so I think going back and saying, I was having a very rough day. I mentioned this to you. It didn't seem that you either picked up on the cues or cared from my perspective. And so it's just at kind of my worst point, and I lashed out. And I apologize for lashing out. Now, that said, I do feel like you hog the conversation, and our conversations are always about your ex and the breakup. And for a period, that was okay. And I can compassionately listen to that. But we're pushing 3 years with this. And I feel it's just become unhealthy for me to continue enabling this conversation.
Ooh, so you'd start by kind of owning your side of the street of like, hey, I realized I waited too long. I decided to pick this day when I wasn't at my best, and I did that, and maybe in an abrasive way. And also, this is what I need differently in this relationship going forward.
Yep. I would reiterate that, yes, because the boundary needs to be there.
Yeah.
And so if you apologize, she could interpret that, or if you only apologize, she could interpret that as, I can still continue engaging with you the way that I have for the past few years.
That we use kind of the explosion to almost start off the conversation. Now I had to apologize for the explosion, but now I have space to actually be honest with what's been bothering me.
Yeah.
And I think Sarah's reaction to that conversation and even willingness to adhere to that boundary will show a lot about the potential for that to be a good friendship.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Socialization is a process where we learn how to behave appropriately because people give us feedback. So I think this is not that we're going to apologize or be expressive to teach Sarah a lesson, but like, I'm sure that this is not the only time Sarah has done something like this. And if somebody continued to have relationship problems and they choose not to take ownership of your feedback, that's their prerogative. But also it can be helpful to share what it's like to interact with somebody, because it gives them outside insight of maybe some social skills that they're lacking. So, I think it is helpful for both the OP and for Sarah to hear how Sarah's been behaving and how that's what it's like to be in a relationship with her.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So given all that we've learned, who do you think was the asshole here?
I think Sarah's an asshole, whether she was intentionally or unintentionally being an emotional vampire and hogging conversations and not picking up on social cues. I think OP is also the asshole because she waited until she hit that exploding point before she communicated a boundary, when there were plenty of opportunities in the past 2+ years to set some boundaries. And so you are an asshole because you didn't take ownership of those opportunities. And I think maybe it's important to know, I don't know for you, but I know for me, what I'm trying to determine who's the asshole and who's not, I'm looking at that person's behavior. I'm also taking in some of the context, but the context doesn't excuse the behavior and inform it. And so again, as I was reading through some of the comments, everybody's saying like, no, you're not the asshole. She was being an emotional vampire. She was hogging the conversations. Yes, Sarah was doing that, but what were you doing?
Right. Like, both people have to have ownership for their reactions to this.
Yes.
Yeah, and if at the end of it she said, "Hey, I've told you not to come over unannounced. You overstayed your welcome. I was trying to be polite and asking you to leave. You disregarded my social cues." So like, if all that, then you kick her out. Fine, that's an okay. But for her to go from 0 to 100 like that, she does have responsibility in that.
Yep.
I don't think she should just apologize and that be it. Right. So yes, apologize, but that's just half of what also should be going on. And again, I think for Sarah to say, "You owe me an apology," like, it's okay, but that's not also all she owes you. Like, there's other things that need to happen too. So I would say halfway there. But yeah, you're right that like Sarah in a vacuum with the OP did. Yeah, that's asshole-ish. We don't get to justify ourselves.
And hopefully Sarah could return the apology with her own ownership and apology for not picking up on cues in that moment, but also not realizing this is all I talked to you about. And you're right. I haven't been an equal friend in this relationship.
Yeah. And I think for them things definitely need to be different going forward. If they both choose to stay in a relationship with this kind of dynamic, that seems pretty unhealthy to me.
Yeah.
So there needs to be some changes here for sure.
I don't know if you recall this phrase, but it's not what you do, it's what you do next.
Ooh,
like we're going to make errors. We're human. We're not going to get it right all of the time. And it's not necessarily that we did something wrong. It's what did we do next? Did we go and make the apology? Did we set the boundary? Did we do the repair work? And so there's no expectation that you get it right 100% of the time, but there is an expectation that what you do next is taking ownership and doing some corrective behaviors.
Yeah. And that's, again, like she was trying to, I think, be gentle and, that was good intentions, but just went on too long without being really direct or honest there.
Yeah.
That's a good point. And, I always say relationships are like the best teachers, so if this was a client, if the OP was my client, I'm going to say, okay, reflect over this, 3-4 year relationship you've had with Sarah. Where were those points where you noticed that you were stuffing what you felt, or that you were people pleasing, or that you were having to get smaller and smaller and smaller? I think really doing like an autopsy when something like this happened, I think there's a lot of good data and information that could probably be gathered from this.
Absolutely.
So that always can do different going forward. So summarize for us, what are our wrap-up thoughts here?
Wrap-up thoughts are, don't wait till you hit a breaking point to communicate your needs and set your boundaries. This will probably be in a lot of wrap-ups, I imagine. Emotional boundaries help protect your emotional energy, and you are in control of that, and you have to divvy that up. Some ways that you can do that is setting some time expectations up front. You can resource out, and that's not being mean or a bad person. It's a kindness to them so that they can actually get their needs met from the conversations. And it's not what you do, it's what you do next. So make necessary apologies, set boundaries in a kind, calm way. And if you need to do some repair work, do some repair work, but you're not expected to get it right the first time. Any added thoughts? Did I miss any? I feel like that was a quick wrap up.
Yeah, sometimes in relationships, there might be disproportionate times where we rely on other people in different ways. So like if you're unsure of if you're dealing with an emotional vampire versus somebody in your support system is just going through a rough patch and you're having to like be in that with them, I think getting some input from other people too can maybe bring some clarity about that, as opposed to just kind of stuffing it and wading through that by yourself. I think that can be hard to determine, but
yes. I think maybe one that we may have missed to recap would be to don't be afraid to suggest therapy. And there are a couple different ways by just kind of pointing out the behavioral patterns of conversations and interactions that you've had with this person and how they're not really changing. You can also do that by communicating your own limitations to being able to support them and kind of referring them out. And then that also naturally leads you to a place where you can set a boundary. And
yeah, very good. That's all I got.
All righty. That's what we have for you guys on emotional boundaries in this post. As always, we'd love to hear your thoughts. You can send them to us, assertivepodcast@gmail.com. And until next time.